The sun shone brightly over the village of St. Mary Mead, casting long, warm shadows over its well-manicured lawns and fragrant flower beds. The morning was quiet, save for the chirping of birds and the distant hum of bees flitting about in the walled gardens of the Vicarage in the heart of the village. Beyond a neatly clipped hedge and a white picket gate stood the charming cottage of Miss Jane Marple. A keen gardener, she took great pleasure in tending to her roses, which bloomed in a splendid array of pinks, whites, and deep crimson reds. It was here, in this very rose garden, that the first sign of something amiss was discovered. That morning, Miss Marple had just finished her breakfast tea, toast, and a small dish of marmalade when her maid, Clara, came bustling in, flustered and pale. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," she stammered, twisting her apron in her hands, "but there's something awful in the garden, right by the roses." Miss Marple, ever unruffled, set down her teacup and rose gracefully. "Come now, Clara, no need to be in such a state. What is it?" "It's a man, miss, a dead man." At that, Miss Marple's expression flickered just slightly, but she said nothing. Instead, she took up her gardening hat and gloves, and, without another word, stepped outside. The rose garden was, as always, immaculately kept. The scent of the blossoms hung thick in the air, mingling with the fresh earthiness of damp soil. And yet, just beyond the climbing roses, half hidden among the thorny stems, lay the body of a man. Miss Marple observed him with the clinical detachment of one who had, on more than one occasion, found herself entangled in the unpleasant business of murder. He was middle-aged, well-dressed in a dark suit, though somewhat travel-worn, and his hands were curled slightly, as though he had clutched at something in his final moments. There was no immediate sign of a struggle, but his face was twisted in an expression of pain. A quick glance around told Miss Marple that nothing in her garden had been disturbed. There were no footprints in the soft soil apart from her own and Clara's, and yet this man whom she did not recognize had died here among her roses. "Do you know him, miss?" Clara whispered, standing behind her mistress as if afraid the body might stir. "No," Miss Marple murmured, "but I rather think we had better call the police." The arrival of Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard an hour later threw the village into a flurry of speculation. Craddock was no stranger to St. Mary Mead, nor to Miss Marple. He greeted her with a firm nod as he crouched beside the body. "Well, Miss Marple, it seems you have found yourself in the midst of another unfortunate occurrence," he remarked dryly. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "The gentleman is hardly my doing, Inspector." "Of course not." He straightened up, surveying the body. "No identification on him, no wallet, no papers. It appears he was placed here deliberately." Miss Marple folded her hands before her. "Or perhaps he wandered in before he died." Craddock glanced at her. "You think he wasn't murdered?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, I believe he was murdered, Inspector. But I don't think he was killed here. He was placed among my roses for a reason, and I dare say it wasn't because of his appreciation for horticulture." Craddock exhaled sharply, looking toward his sergeant, who was already setting up a perimeter around the cottage. The usual chatter of villagers had begun to gather outside the gate, whispering among themselves. Mrs. Dolly Bantry from the manor house leaned over the fence, eyes wide with interest. "Miss Marple, dear, do tell us what has happened. The most extraordinary rumors are already going around." Miss Marple gave a polite smile. "A most unfortunate incident, Mrs. Bantry, but I think it is best if we let the inspector handle it." Dolly, who had known Jane Marple long enough to recognize her understated way of speaking, pursed her lips. "That means you've already formed an opinion, doesn't it?" Miss Marple simply turned her attention back to the body, while Craddock sighed. He knew better than to ignore her insights. The day wore on with questions, but few answers. The body was removed the crime scene combed for evidence, but there was little to be found. The villagers, meanwhile, were abuzz with theories. "Some drifter, most likely," said Mr. Phelps, the grocer, shaking his head as he unpacked cabbages. "Nonsense," countered Reverend Humphreys. "He was well dressed. Hardly a drifter. But no one in the village knows him." Mrs. Bates, the innkeeper, pointed out. "How did he come here?" Carriage. A group of parishioners debated whether the man had been poisoned or simply collapse of natural causes. Meanwhile, in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting in her usual serene fashion. But in her mind, she was already piecing together the peculiar puzzle. Why had the man been placed in her garden? He had died elsewhere. Who had moved him? And most importantly, who was he? Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. Someone in the village knew more than they were saying. She was quite sure of it. The body had scarcely been removed from Miss Marple's rose garden when the village of St. Mary Mead erupted into a frenzy of speculation. By lunchtime, every tea shop, post office queue, and vicarage gathering had become an impromptu forum for the most thrilling gossip the village had seen in years. Who was the dead man? How had he come to be in Miss Marple's garden? And, most importantly, who had killed him? Miss Marple, as was her way, listened quietly. She had no need to contribute to the gossip. She had her own methods of uncovering the truth, methods that involved patience, keen observation, and an intimate knowledge of human nature. And she was certain of one thing already. Whoever had placed that body among her roses had done so with a purpose. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, had taken up residence at the local inn, where he was methodically interviewing every soul in St. Mary Mead. He had started with the most practical question: had anyone seen the man before? "No, never," was the universal answer. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to take such declarations at face value. People often failed to notice what was right in front of them, and memories were unreliable, particularly when they wished to be. Craddock called on Miss Marple that afternoon, arriving with a serious expression and a notebook in hand. "We have identified him," he said, without preamble, as she offered him a seat by the fireplace. Miss Marple, who was pouring tea, merely raised an eyebrow. "Have you indeed?" Craddock nodded. His name was Mr. Robert Pendleton. He was a solicitor from London, though originally from a town not far from here. Miss Marple's fingers paused just slightly as she set down the teapot. "A solicitor," Craddock continued, 48 years old. "Worked for a well-respected legal firm. By all accounts, an ordinary man. No criminal record, no debts." But he hesitated. He hadn't been in contact with his family for years. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "That is interesting," Craddock sighed, rubbing his chin. And another thing, his cause of death was poison. Cyanide, most likely. He'd been dead for at least 6 hours before we found him. As Miss Marple tapped her teaspoon against her saucer, "which means he died elsewhere and was later placed in my garden." "Exactly." Craddock leaned forward. "And I want to know why?" Miss Marple took a sip of her tea before speaking. "Then I think, Inspector, we must begin by asking what brought Mr. Pendleton to St. Mary Mead in the first place." With this new information, the village's curiosity only deepened. A solicitor from London, what business had he had here? Miss Marple set about making quiet inquiries of her own, stopping by the shops and listening to the idle chatter that swirled around her. It was at the post office that she heard something particularly interesting. Young Jenny Bartlett, the postmistress's assistant, was talking animatedly to Mrs. Green, the butcher's wife. "He did come in, you know," Jenny was saying. "The dead man, I mean." Miss Marple, standing by the rack of postcards, adjusted her hat ever so slightly to listen more closely. "I saw him myself on Friday afternoon," Jenny continued. "He came in to ask about telegrams, but then changed his mind. Seemed all nervous like." Miss Marple turned to face her with an encouraging smile. Did he send anything in the end, my dear? Jenny jumped slightly at being addressed by Miss Marple, but shook her head. No, Miss Marple. He just stood there a moment, then left without sending anything at all. That is very useful to know, Miss Marple said warmly. Did he say anything else? Jenny frowned, clearly pleased to be consulted on so serious a matter. Well, only that he looked troubled, like he wasn't sure whether to go through with it. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Mr. Pendleton had been here on business. Why had he hesitated to send a message? And to whom had he intended to write? The next morning, Miss Marple took a stroll toward the village inn. If Mr. Pendleton had been visiting St. Mary Mead, he must have stayed somewhere. And there was only one place for an outsider to lodge. Mr. Tompkins, the innkeeper, was standing at the door, chatting to a few of the regulars. He greeted Miss Marple with a respectful nod as she approached. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, wiping his hands on his apron. Terrible business. This murder. Can't think what the world is coming to. Indeed, Mr. Tompkins, Miss Marple said kindly. I wondered if you might help me with a small matter. You see, I understand that Mr. Pendleton, the dead man. Yes, I understand he may have stayed here. Tompkins scratched his head. No, Miss Marple, I don't recall him at all. No one by that name booked a room. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I see. And yet, my dear Mr. Tompkins, he must have stayed somewhere. People don't simply sleep in hedgerows in St. Mary Mead. Tompkins looked a little sheepish. Well, now that you mention it, miss, there was a gentleman who stopped by a couple of nights ago, asking about a room. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, and did he stay? No, miss. He didn't like the look of our rooms, I suppose, left soon after, saying he'd find other arrangements. Miss Marple pressed no further, merely smiling as she thanked him. But as she walked away, her mind was already working rapidly. Mr. Pendleton had come to St. Mary Mead. He had been seen at the post office, clearly uncertain about sending a message. I had sought accommodation, but had seemingly found somewhere else to stay. But where? And more importantly, whom had he come to see? That evening, Miss Marple sat knitting by her fireplace when a memory stirred in her mind. Robert Pendleton. She had never met the man, but something about the name felt oddly familiar. She thought back years ago. There had been another Pendleton in the area. A young woman, a girl who had lived in St. Mary Mead before vanishing without a trace. What had her name been? Miss Marple set down her knitting and went to her small desk. There, tucked in a drawer, was an old parish registry from years past, one of the many records she kept for no reason other than curiosity. She flipped through the pages, and there, in faded ink, she found it. Margaret Pendleton. Miss Marple sat back, her blue eyes bright with interest. A solicitor from London had arrived in St. Mary Mead and died under suspicious circumstances. He had hesitated to send a telegram. He had sought a room, then disappeared, and now his name was tied to a woman who had once lived here, someone who had disappeared from village life long ago. Miss Marple had no doubt that the two were connected. The question was, how and who in the village had wanted Robert Pendleton dead? Miss Marple sat quietly in her small sitting room, fingers deftly working the needles of her knitting, though her mind was far from the soft wool passing through her hands. The name in the old parish registry, Margaret Pendleton, continued to echo in her thoughts. The memory was distant, but she was certain it was relevant. A solicitor from London, Robert Pendleton, had turned up dead in her rose garden, poisoned with cyanide. He had hesitated to send a telegram. He had arrived in St. Mary Mead with some purpose, but no one admitted to knowing him. And yet, decades ago, there had been a Margaret Pendleton in the village. Coincidence? Miss Marple had long since ceased to believe in such things. The next morning, she made her way to St. Mary Mead's vicarage, where Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife, Griselda, resided. The Reverend, a thoughtful man with a keen sense of history, might well remember something about the Pendleton name. She found him in his study, poring over some old church records. He looked up in mild surprise as she entered. "Ah, Miss Marple. What an unexpected pleasure. Rayos, I assume this visit has something to do with the dreadful business of the dead man." Miss Marple smiled as she settled into the chair he offered. "Indeed. Reverend, I wonder if you might help me recall something. Do you remember a Margaret Pendleton who lived in St. Mary Mead some years ago?" The vicar frowned, adjusting his glasses. Pendleton. The name does sound familiar. "Ah, yes, I believe she lived here in the early 1900s, but it was rather a scandal, if I recall correctly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A scandal, you say?" "Yes." The Reverend hesitated, as if debating whether to speak further. Then, lowering his voice, he continued, "Margaret Pendleton was the daughter of a respectable family, but she ran away under questionable circumstances." "Questionable?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, there were rumors. She disappeared rather suddenly, and some said she had eloped with a married man. Others claimed she had simply left to seek her fortune in London. Whatever the truth was, she never returned." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. A woman named Pendleton had disappeared long ago, and now a man named Pendleton, a solicitor from London, had turned up dead. Had Robert Pendleton been related to her? A son, a nephew, a brother? And had he come to St. Mary Mead seeking answers about her disappearance? Miss Marple's next stop was the cottage of Mrs. Beatrice Partridge, the self-proclaimed historian of St. Mary Mead, who prided herself on knowing the intricate details of every family that had lived in the village. Mrs. Partridge, a thin woman with sharp features and a sharper tongue, welcomed Miss Marple with barely concealed curiosity. "Now, Jane, I expect you've come about that dreadful murder?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "I was hoping you might help me recall something from the past, Beatrice. Do you remember Margaret Pendleton?" Mrs. Partridge pursed her lips, clearly pleased to be asked. "Oh, indeed I do. The Pendletons were a fine family once. Margaret was a striking young woman, very well-mannered. But she disappeared, you know. Ran off with a man at least. That's what they said at the time." Miss Marple noted the way she said they. The villagers loved their gossip, but rarely knew the full truth. "Do you know what became of her?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Partridge sniffed. "Not a soul does. The family was ruined by the scandal, though. Her father, Henry Pendleton, sold their house and left the village. No one ever heard from them again." Miss Marple's mind sharpened. The Pendleton family had been forced to leave St. Mary Mead after Margaret's disappearance. Could Robert Pendleton have been a descendant trying to uncover his family's past? More importantly, had someone in the village wanted to keep those secrets buried? Miss Marple's next course of action was to visit the one tangible remnant of the Pendleton family, the house they had once owned. It had long since changed hands, but she knew that whoever lived there now might have some knowledge of its past. The house, a modest yet elegant structure on the edge of the village, now belonged to a Mr. and Mrs. Lorimer, a quiet couple who had moved to St. Mary Mead a few years prior. Miss Marple, always skilled in the art of friendly conversation, paid them a casual visit under the guise of admiring their garden. Mrs. Lorimer, a pale woman with nervous eyes, seemed hesitant when Miss Marple inquired about the house's history. "Oh, we don't know much about the previous owners," she said quickly. "It was empty for some years before we moved in." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not entirely empty, my dear. There were still traces of its past, I imagine." Mrs. Lorimer hesitated before nodding. Well, yes. There was an old trunk in the attic when we first arrived. My husband wanted to throw it out, but I was curious. It belonged to the Pendletons, I believe." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And did you find anything interesting?" Lorimer hesitated. "There were letters inside, very old ones, but we didn't keep them. Gave him two. She stopped suddenly, as if realizing she had said too much. Miss Marple caught the hesitation instantly. You gave them two. Mrs. Lorimer looked flustered. Oh, it was nothing, really. It's just some old letters. We mentioned them to someone in the village. That's all. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her mind was racing. Someone in the village had seen those letters, and soon after, Robert Pendleton had arrived and been murdered. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, she noted the subtle changes in its usual routine. There was an underlying tension among the residents, careful avoidance of certain topics, an eagerness to turn conversations away from the murder. She had seen it before. People were hiding something. The Pendleton family scandal had been buried long ago. Now, decades later, someone had come searching for the truth, and someone else had killed him to keep it hidden. Miss Marple had no doubt that the answer to Robert Pendleton's murder lay in the past. She just had to find out who had the most to lose. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way toward the village square. St. Mary Mead was always at its busiest at this time, bakers delivering fresh bread, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, and villagers exchanging the latest news in hushed voices over their shopping baskets. But today, something was different. There was an undercurrent of unease, a certain tight-lipped hesitation that Miss Marple had learned to recognize. A murder in their midst had unsettled the village, but more than that, it had awakened long-buried secrets. And if there was one thing people feared more than murder, it was the past coming back to haunt them. She observed small details as she walked: Mrs. Weatherby clutching her shawl too tightly, Mr. Gibbons avoiding eye contact, young Sarah Downs whispering urgently to her friend before falling silent as Miss Marple approached. Yes, the village knew something, and Miss Marple intended to find out what. She found Constable Barnes outside the post office, looking rather troubled. He had the distinct air of a man in over his head, his cap slightly askew, his fingers tapping anxiously against his notebook. Ah, Miss Marple, he said as she approached. You wouldn't happen to be on your way to see Inspector Fletcher, would you? Hadn't planned to, she admitted, but I do have a few thoughts about this dreadful business. The constable hesitated, then lowered his voice. It's an odd thing, ma'am. Inspector Fletcher's been receiving anonymous letters. Nasty ones. Someone in the village wants him to stop digging into the past. It's Marple's interest. Sharpened threats. Constable Barnes shifted uncomfortably. More like warnings. Telling him he's meddling where he ought not to. That if he keeps prying into the Pendleton family business, he'll regret it. Miss Marple knitted her brows. So, someone was afraid of the past being unearthed. Tell me, Constable, she said gently, did the inspector happen to mention who these letters might be from? Barnes shook his head. No name, just signed a friend. Fletcher. Reckons it's someone local, someone who knows more than they're letting on. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. If the inspector was getting warnings, then he was getting close to something, and that meant she was as well as Miss Marple. Continued her walk. She noticed a stranger standing at the entrance to the village, a woman perhaps in her mid-50s, with a lined but once beautiful face, her hair swept into an elegant chignon. She was dressed in fine but slightly outdated clothing, as if she had once been wealthy but had since fallen on harder times. Miss Marple's intuition told her this was no ordinary visitor. She approached with her usual unassuming manner. Good morning, my dear. You seem a little lost. The woman turned, startled. Up close, Miss Marple could see the trace of sadness behind her eyes. I was looking for someone, the woman admitted hesitantly. Or rather, I was hoping to find something. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Would it, by any chance, be Margaret Pendleton you were looking for? The woman gasped. You know of her? Miss Marple smiled gently. I believe many people in this village remember Margaret Pendleton, though few speak of her. The woman looked away, clearly composing herself. When she turned back, her expression was guarded. "My name is Eleanor Gray. I believe I may be connected to her." Miss Marple waited patiently. People often revealed more when given the space to do so. Sure enough, after a brief pause, Eleanor sighed. "She was my mother." Marple's hands remained steady on her handbag, though her mind was worried. So Margaret Pendleton had a daughter, one who had never been part of St. Mary Mead's gossip before now, which meant the Pendleton family secrets were deeper than anyone had suspected. Miss Marple invited Eleanor to tea at her cottage, where the woman, clearly grateful for the kindness, slowly began to speak. "My mother never spoke much about her past," Eleanor admitted, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "She always seemed burdened, as if something weighed on her. I only learned she came from this village after she passed away. Among her belongings, I found an old letter addressed to someone here in St. Mary Mead." She reached into her handbag and carefully unfolded a delicate, yellowed sheet of paper. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the faded ink. "Dearest Henry, I have done something terrible. I never meant for it to happen, but it is too late now. Please, if you can, forgive me. Meet me in the rose garden at twilight." Miss Marple set the letter down carefully. "Your mother wrote this to Henry Pendleton, her father." Miss Marple read the words twice. The rose garden. She felt a familiar chill. Robert Pendleton had been found murdered in the rose garden. And now, decades later, here was a letter written by Margaret mentioning the same place in a desperate plea for forgiveness. The past was repeating itself. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, but he never received it. I found it hidden inside an old book. Never sent." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Why do you think she never sent it?" Eleanor hesitated. Because I think something happened before she had the chance." A heavy silence filled the room. Miss Marple's mind was fitting the pieces together. Margaret had vanished suddenly, leaving scandal and speculation in her wake. Had she been about to reveal a terrible truth? And had someone stopped her before she could? Robert Pendleton had been searching for that same truth. Then he, too, had been silenced. Miss Marple looked at Eleanor kindly. "My dear, I believe your mother knew something that someone in this village wanted buried forever." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. "Do you think she was murdered?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think it is possible, Brent. If that was true, then the murderer from the past was still in St. Mary Mead, still living among them, and still willing to kill to keep their secret." The village was alive with speculation. Though the police had been careful to keep certain details of Robert Pendleton's murder under wraps, word had spread nonetheless. The villagers whispered about his death in the rose garden, the sudden return of his estranged son, and now a mysterious woman who claimed to be Margaret Pendleton's daughter. Miss Marple, ever observant, saw the way certain faces tensed at the mention of Eleanor Gray. It was not just shock at an unexpected visitor, it was something deeper. Fear that the past would no longer remain buried, and Miss Marple, with her soft voice and keen eyes, was determined to see that it did not. Eleanor Gray had taken a room at the village inn, and that afternoon Miss Marple decided to visit her once more. But as she neared the inn's entrance, she paused. At the far end of the narrow lane, near the ivy-covered wall, a man stood speaking to Eleanor, or rather arguing with her. Miss Marple recognized him immediately. Reverend Leonard Harper, vicar of St. Mary Mead. Normally a calm and pleasant man, he was now tense, his voice low and urgent. Eleanor, for her part, looked equally distressed. Miss Marple stepped closer, remaining unseen behind a hedgerow. She could not make out every word, but what she did hear was enough to prickle her instincts. "Should not have come back," the vicar was saying. His tone was uncharacteristically sharp. "I have a right to be here," Eleanor replied. This was my mother's home. A pause. Then, the vicar's voice dropped to a whisper. She left. For a reason. Miss Marple's breath caught. Before she could hear more, Eleanor spotted her and stiffened. The vicar turned, startled, and for a moment, his kindly face flickered with something else wary. Guilt. Then he smiled, though the warmth did not quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Marple, out for your afternoon walk?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Why, yes. And what a coincidence, Eleanor and I were just about to have a cup of tea." She turned to Eleanor with a kindly expression. "Would you care to join me, dear?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. The vicar's fingers twitched at his side, but he merely inclined his head. "Well, I won't keep you then. Good day, Miss Gray." Miss Marple. With that, he turned and walked away, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if weighed down by something unseen. Miss Marple made a mental note. A reverend, burdened by secrets, was always worth investigating. Over tea in the inn's small sitting room, Miss Marple waited for Eleanor to speak. She had long since learned that people reveal more when they are not rushed. Eleanor stirred her tea, staring at the liquid as if searching for answers. Then she sighed. "The vicar knew my mother, didn't he?" Miss Marple nodded. "He did. In fact, he was here in St. Mary Mead even before your mother left." Eleanor bit her lip. "He told me something strange, that my mother left for a reason. But no one has told me what that reason was." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Perhaps, my dear, it is because they fear you'll find out something they would rather keep hidden." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Do you believe my mother was murdered?" Miss Marple considered her words carefully. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Margaret Pendleton knew something dangerous, and that knowledge may have put her at risk." Eleanor swallowed. "And now Robert Pendleton is dead." Miss Marple nodded. A long silence stretched between them. Then Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out another item. It was an old photograph, slightly faded at the edges. "My mother," she whispered. Miss Marple took the photograph and examined it carefully. The young woman in the image was lovely soft curls, a bright yet thoughtful expression. She stood in front of an ornate stone archway, one Miss Marple recognized instantly. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes were drawn to something else. Nan's hand rested lightly on Margaret's shoulder just at the edge of the frame. The rest of the figure had been cropped out, but Miss Marple could see the cuff of a dark suit and the edge of a signet ring. Someone had stood beside Margaret Pendleton in that garden, and someone had deliberately removed them from the picture. That evening, as Miss Marple returned home, she found something unexpected waiting for her. A note slipped beneath her cottage door. She unfolded it, her fingers steady despite the strange foreboding in her chest. The message was simple. "Stay out of this. Some secrets are best left buried, Miss." Marple's eyes flickered with something like satisfaction. A warning meant that someone was afraid. And in St. Mary Mead, the truly guilty always revealed themselves in time. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself as she folded the note and placed it in her knitting basket. She had no intention of stopping. If anything, this only meant she was getting closer to the truth, and she would see it through to the very end. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the ominous note resting on the small table beside her tea tray. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the sitting room. Outside, St. Mary Mead remained deceptively peaceful. Its ivy-covered cottages, winding lanes, and the scent of late summer roses carried on the evening breeze. But beneath that tranquility, a dark undercurrent swirled. Someone in the village, someone desperate and afraid, wanted her to abandon her quiet inquiries. Miss Marple took another sip of tea, then neatly folded the note and tucked it away. It was not the first warning she had received in her long years of observation, and she very much doubted it would be the last the following morning. Just as the village square came to life with murmured gossip and the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, Inspector Morton arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's door. She welcomed him inside, offering a cup of tea, which he declined with a polite but impatient shake of his head. "Miss Marple," he said, getting straight to the point, "I must ask, have you been making inquiries into Mr. Pendleton's murder?" Miss Marple's face remained serene. "Why, Inspector, I merely listen. People do have a habit of talking, you know." Inspector Morton exhaled sharply. "It seems someone isn't pleased with your listening." He withdrew a small envelope from his coat and placed it on the table. Miss Marple instantly recognized the neat but impersonal handwriting. Oh, second warning. Old women should mind their knitting. A rather unoriginal threat, Miss Marple thought. She looked up at Morton, her expression unreadable. "And where did you find this?" "Tied to your garden gate," Morton replied grimly. "Whoever left it wanted to make sure you saw it." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then I must be on the right track, mustn't I?" Morton sighed. "Miss Marple, I strongly advise you to leave the detecting to the professionals." She finished for him, her blue eyes twinkling. "I would never dream of interfering, Inspector." Morton looked as if he very much doubted that. Still, he hesitated for a moment before finally saying, "If you uncover anything useful, you will come to me first." Miss Marple gave him a reassuring nod. "Of course, dear." Inspector Morton did not seem entirely convinced, but after another searching look, he left. Miss Marple waited until the door had fully closed before she picked up the note again. Whoever had written it had made one fatal mistake. They had assumed Miss Marple was the sort to be frightened away. She was not. Later that day, Miss Marple attended the afternoon church service, slipping into a back pew with her usual unobtrusive grace. The small stone church of St. Mary Mead was quiet and cool, the air filled with the scent of wax and old wood. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Harper, stood at the pulpit, delivering a sermon on the virtues of honesty, and yet Miss Marple could not help but notice that the vicar himself seemed troubled. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages of his Bible. He stumbled over his words once or twice, an unusual occurrence for a man normally so composed and confident. After the service, Miss Marple made her way toward him just as he was preparing to leave. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his smile somewhat forced. "A lovely sermon today, wasn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed kindly, "though I couldn't help but sense that you were rather preoccupied, Reverend. I do hope you are not unwell." For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps fear. It was gone, replaced with a chuckle. "Oh, just the weight of responsibility, you know. The village relies on me, and I do my best." Miss Marple nodded. "And, of course, the past has a way of making its presence felt, doesn't it?" The vicar stiffened. I'm not sure what you mean." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Margaret Pendleton." A long silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the vicar said, "Miss Marple, let it rest." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "But why, Reverend? What is it that frightens you so?" He opened his mouth as if to speak, but then shook his head. "Some truths do more harm than good," he murmured. "Please, for everyone's sake, leave it alone." He turned and walked away before she could press him further. Miss Marple watched him go, her suspicions deepening. What had Margaret Pendleton known all those years ago? And was that same truth what had led to Robert Pendleton's death? That evening, just as the last light of day was fading, Miss Marple heard an urgent knocking at her door. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Eleanor Gray, her face pale and eyes wide with distress. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I need to tell you something." Miss Marple guided her inside, settling her in a chair and handing her a cup of tea. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the cup. I know why my mother left St. Mary Mead," she said. her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple waited patiently. Eleanor took a deep breath. My mother. She was in love with someone. Someone she shouldn't have been. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. And that someone was. Eleanor hesitated. 10. At last, she whispered. The vicar. Miss Marple did not react outwardly, though a deep part of her had already suspected as much. My grandfather, Robert Pendleton, discovered their relationship. Eleanor continued. He was furious. He threatened to ruin my mother, to disgrace her. He made her leave, Miss Marple. He made her disappear. The weight of the revelation hung between them. Robert Pendleton is dead now, Eleanor whispered. And someone in this village, they still don't want the truth to come out. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, and she had a strong suspicion that Robert Pendleton's murder was the price someone had paid to keep that truth buried. The question was who? And how far were they willing to go to protect their secret? Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her teacup. She intended to find out. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a hush, the kind that settles when people begin to suspect that trouble is closer than they imagined. The murder of Robert Pendleton had already unsettled the locals, but now Miss Marple sensed a shifter. Growing fear and unspoken dread. Secrets, she had often observed, had a way of festering. They did not like to be disturbed, and when they were, they could lead to desperate actions. Eleanor Gray's revelation from the previous evening still rang in Miss Marple's mind. Margaret Pendleton, the daughter, driven away in shame. The woman whose life had been altered forever by the man now lying dead. And the vicar, Reverend Leonard Harper, had been afraid of something buried in the past, something he had refused to speak of. Miss Marple stirred her tea absent-mindedly as she sat in her cottage, considering her next step. Outside, the rose garden remained untouched since the discovery of Pendleton's body. A dark reminder that the village's peace had been violated. She glanced at the anonymous warning. Note, Inspector Morton had found tied to her gate. Old women should mind their knitting. That, she thought with mild amusement, was exactly what she intended to do, knit the loose threads together until they formed a clear picture. Miss Marple decided that it was time to visit Margaret Pendleton's old home, now standing empty on the far edge of the village. The house was small but dignified, its walls covered in ivy. The garden had long since grown wild, overtaking what had once been a well-tended path. As she approached, she noticed a figure lingering near the gate. It was Dr. Geoffrey Braithwaite, the village physician, a polite and well-respected man. Dr. Braithwaite was known for his calm demeanor and his unwavering discretion, but as Miss Marple watched him, she saw that he was hesitant, uncertain, perhaps even troubled. Doctor, she greeted him gently, stepping forward. Dr. Braithwaite turned sharply. Miss Marple, you startled me. My apologies. I was just admiring the house. Margaret Pendleton's former home, is it not? The doctor hesitated before nodding. Yes, it has been empty for years. Miss Marple studied him carefully. You knew her, didn't you? Dr. Braithwaite let out a soft sigh. Yes, I did. She was a patient of mine before she left the village. A kind woman, intelligent, but she had a heavy heart. Miss Marple noted the wistfulness in his voice. She was in love. I understand. His jaw tightened. Yes, with the vicar. His eyes snapped to hers, startled. He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. It was a scandal at the time. They were discreet, but people suspected. And Robert Pendleton made sure she suffered. For it, Miss Marple's mind whirred. Did she ever confide in you? Dr. Braithwaite hesitated again. She told me something once, something that worried me, but I swore to keep her confidence. Even now, Miss Marple asked gently. The doctor exhaled heavily. I don't know anymore. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on his arm. Doctor, a man is dead. Margaret knew something that could explain what happened. Dr. Braithwaite's eyes clouded with conflict. Finally, he said, "I must think on it." With that, he turned and walked away. Miss Marple watched him go. He knew something, and she intended to find out what. Miss Marple had only just returned to her cottage. She heard the urgent ringing of the church bell. Something was wrong. The bell was not sounding for a scheduled service. With surprising speed, Miss Marple made her way toward the church. As she arrived, she found a small group of villagers gathered outside, their faces pale and anxious. Inside, near the altar, a body lay sprawled. It was Reverend Leonard Harper. A thick book, his Bible, lay open beside him. The pages crumpled where his fingers had clawed at them. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "He's alive," Dr. Braithwaite announced, kneeling beside him. "But barely. Poisoned, I suspect." Miss Marple's sharp gaze moved across the scene, taking in every detail. The vicar's teacup lay overturned on the floor, a dark stain spreading across the stone. Someone had tried to silence him, and suddenly Miss Marple knew without a doubt that she was close to the truth. While the doctor and the villagers tended to the vicar, Miss Marple's attention shifted to his office. She had no time to waste. Slipping away unnoticed, she entered the vicarage. It was a tidy space, though books and papers were stacked haphazardly. Miss Marple knew what she was looking for. She scanned the desk, the shelves, the drawers until, in a small wooden box, she found an envelope. It was old, yellowed with time. Name written on it was unmistakable: Margaret Pendleton, with a careful hand. Miss Marple unfolded the letter inside. The words, though faded, sent a chill down her spine. "Leonard, I am leaving St. Mary Mead, but I must tell you the truth before I go. There is something I have never spoken of, something I have kept hidden even from you. My father, Robert Pendleton's not the man the village believes him to be. He has done terrible things. He has hurt people, ruined lives, and I fear he will do worse before he is finished. If anything should happen to me, know this: the truth lies in the rose garden. Margaret." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the letter. Robert Pendleton had not been merely a strict, unforgiving man. He had been a destroyer of lives, and someone still alive had killed him. To keep that truth buried, Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. She knew now that the key to the mystery lay in the rose garden, and she intended to uncover it before the murderer struck again. The morning after Reverend Harper's poisoning was grim. St. Mary Mead had not experienced such an unsettling crime in years. And now the vicar, a well-respected and trusted man, lay unconscious in his bed, fighting for his life. Miss Marple, however, was not one to let fear cloud her judgment. The letter she had found in the vicar's study sat safely inside her knitting basket, tainted, unread by anyone but herself. If anything should happen to me, to know this: the truth lies in the rose garden. The phrase had echoed in her mind all night, and she knew there was only one place she needed to be. It was still early when Miss Marple arrived at the Pendleton estate. A soft mist clung to the hedges, curling around the statues that lined the once beautiful garden. The roses, however, were in full bloom, their deep crimson petals stark against the morning light. She took a careful step toward the flower beds. It was here that Robert Pendleton had been found murdered, and somewhere in this garden a secret had been buried. Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the rose garden, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The soil near one of the bushes looked disturbed, as though it had been turned recently. Her heart quickened. Someone had been digging. She knelt, brushing aside the leaves and loose earth, and her fingers found something solid, a small, rusted tin box. With careful precision, she pried it open. Inside was a bundle of old papers, discolored from time, but still readable. As she unfolded them, a word caught her eye: blackmail. Her breath hitched as she skimmed the pages. It was a ledger. Page after page detailed names, dates, and amounts of money transactions recorded in Robert Pendleton's unmistakable handwriting. Miss Marple felt a chill run through her. Robert Pendleton had been a blackmailer. The names listed were those of respectable villagers, people who had seemingly lived quiet, uneventful lives. Eleanor Gray, Dr. Braithwaite, Reverend Harper, even Margaret Pendleton herself. Was this the Secretan had not been killed in a moment of blind rage? His murder had been deliberate, as Margaret had tried to tell the vicar all those years ago. Miss Marple cold the box and took a steadying breath. Robert Pendleton had killed him to keep this truth from coming to light. Looking for something, Miss Marple? The voice, low and cool, sent a prickle down her spine. She turned. Eleanor Gray stood at the edge of the garden, watching her. Miss Marple met her gaze calmly, just admiring the roses, dear. They do seem to thrive, don't they? Eleanor's lips pressed together. I heard someone moving about. Thought I'd come to see. Miss Marple noted the tension in her stance, the way her hands were clasped tightly together. Lena's eyes flickered toward the tin box. She had seen it. Miss Marple gave a pleasant smile, slipping the box into her handbag. A beautiful morning for a walk, wouldn't you agree? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, she said, "Be careful, Miss Marple. There are things in this village best left buried." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Miss Marple remained standing, the weight of the tin box in her handbag heavier than before. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. The house was quiet, save for the faint rustling of curtains in the upstairs window where Reverend Harper lay resting. She knocked, and after a moment, Dr. Braithwaite opened the door. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice weary. "This is hardly the time." "I believe it is exactly the time, Doctor," she replied gently. She stepped past him into the study, placing the tin box carefully on the desk. "I found this buried in the rose garden." Dr. Braithwaite's face paled. His fingers twitched at his sides. "Where did you? I think you know what it is." He swallowed hard, then exhaled. Robert Pendleton was a vile man. He made it his business to know other people's sins, and when he knew them, he made sure they paid for his silence. Miss Marple nodded, including Margaret. Dr. Braithwaite hesitated. Then, with a bitter sigh, he said, "Margaret was young, naive. She made a mistake, one that Pendleton used against her. He threatened to ruin her, to destroy any chance she had at happiness. She left because of him." Miss Marple studied him. "Can you, Doctor? Were you one of his victims too?" Dr. Braithwaite's lips pressed together. He did not answer, but his silence spoke volumes. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, knitting, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. Her mind was working through the final pieces of the puzzle. Who had the strongest motive? Who had the opportunity? And, most importantly, who had the most to lose? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Eleanor Gray. Her face was pale, her eyes darting behind her as if she feared someone had followed. "Miss Marple," she whispered urgently, stepping inside. "I need to tell you something." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit, but Eleanor remained standing, wringing her hands. "I know who killed Robert Pendleton." Miss Marple did not react. She simply waited. Eleanor took a deep breath. It was the window shattered. A rock crashed onto the floor, shards of glass flying across the room. Miss Marple's heart pounded. Eleanor let out a strangled cry, stepping back. Outside, footsteps fled into the night. Someone did not want Eleanor to speak. Miss Marple straightened. She had no doubt now. She was closer than ever to the truth, and someone watching from the shadows was desperate to keep it hidden. The shattered window cast eerie shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room, the broken glass glinting in the firelight. Eleanor Gray stood trembling by the fireplace, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Outside, the footsteps had long since faded into silence, but the message had been clear. Someone wanted Eleanor to remain silent. Miss Marple calmly picked up the rock from the floor, turning it over in her hand. A scrap of paper had been tied to it with twine. Gently, she untied it and unfolded the note. Some secrets should remain buried. Miss Marple sighed. The note was hastily written, the ink smudged in places, as if scrawled in a moment of desperation. She turned to Eleanor, who was still clutching the edge of the mantelpiece. "My dear, I believe you are about to tell me something rather important," Miss Marple said softly. Eleanor swallowed hard. I can't," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Not now. Not after this." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Eleanor, someone has gone to great lengths to frighten you. That tells me what you know is very, very dangerous to them." Eleanor hesitated, her eyes darting to the broken window. Then she shook her head. "I need to go. I should never have come." Before Miss Marple could stop her, Eleanor turned and fled into the night. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Chief Inspector Craddock, who had been stationed at the village police office since the murder. He looked up from his desk as she entered, his expression weary. "I was just about to call on you, Miss Marple," he said. "Something's not right about this case, and I have a feeling you know more than you're letting on." Miss Marple smiled primly and took a seat. "It's always wise to trust one's instincts, Chief Inspector." Craddock sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "The vicar still hasn't regained consciousness, but Dr. Braithwaite tells me his condition is improving. That means he might be able to tell us what he knew." Miss Marple nodded. "And in the meantime, we must consider what led to his poisoning in the first place. He knew something about Robert Pendleton's death, something worth killing for." She placed the rusted tin box on the desk. Craddock frowned as he opened it, flipping through the pages inside. His expression darkened. "So Pendleton was a blackmailer," he murmured. "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And I believe it was one of his victims who finally put an end to him." Craddock exhaled sharply. "It's a long list of names here. Practically half the village had a reason to want him dead." Miss Marple nodded, which means we must look closer not at just the obvious motives, but at who had the opportunity. Craddock frowned. "You already have someone in mind." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. "I believe I do." That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to the Pendleton estate. The house loomed large against the gray sky, its windows dark and foreboding. Margaret Pendleton answered the door herself, her face drawn and pale. She stepped aside silently, allowing Miss Marple to enter. Miss Marple took in the once elegant sitting room, now dim and heavy, with an air of sadness. Margaret finally spoke. "Suppose you've come to tell me the village thinks I killed my husband." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle. "Margaret, I know you didn't." Margaret's eyes widened slightly before she quickly masked her expression. "Then why are you here?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, folding her hands in her lap. "'Cause I believe you've been protecting someone." Margaret stiffened. "That's absurd." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Is it? You knew what Robert was, didn't you? You knew about the blackmail?" Margaret's fingers clenched at her sides, but she remained silent. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft. "You left all those years ago because of him, didn't you? Because he held something over you, and yet you came back. Why?" Margaret's lips trembled. "Because I had no choice." Miss Marple nodded. "Because he threatened someone you loved." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "He would have ruined her," she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Eleanor Gray." Margaret's breath hitched. "She wasn't just someone Robert blackmailed," Miss Marple continued. "She was your daughter." A sob broke from Margaret's lips. She buried her face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, she's my daughter. And Robert he found out years ago. He threatened to tell the whole village to ruin her life." Miss Marple reached out and patted Margaret's hand. Gently. "You came back to keep an eye on him, didn't you? To make sure he didn't hurt her." Margaret nodded, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but firm. "Did you kill him, Margaret?" Margaret lifted her tear-streaked face. "No," she whispered. "But I think I know who did." Miss Marple returned to her cottage. As the evening drew in, the village was quiet, the sky darkening as storm clouds gathered. She had all the pieces now. She knew who had done it, and she knew how to prove it. She took a seat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily now. All she needed to do was set the trap. Tomorrow, she would call everyone together, and then the truth would finally come out. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village green as the residents of St. Mary Mead gathered in the sitting room of the Pendleton estate. A tension thick as fog hung in the air, every whisper and glance filled with suspicion. Miss Marple sat calmly in an armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she surveyed the assembled guests. Margaret Pendleton, pale and drawn, clutched a handkerchief between trembling fingers. Eleanor Gray stood apart, arms folded tightly, as though bracing herself for a storm. Chief Inspector Craddock, standing near the hearth, kept a sharp eye on the room, and then there were the others, the ones who had hovered at the edges of the mystery, each with their own secrets, their own lies. Dr. Braithwaite, who had been so quick to declare the vicar's illness a simple poisoning. Edwin Collins, the village solicitor, whose presence in Pendleton's affairs had always been more than professional. Jane Hargrove, the gardener, who had seen more than she ever admitted. Miss Marple looked up, setting her knitting aside. "Thank you all for coming," she said with a pleasant smile. "I believe we are now in a position to resolve this most distressing affair." Craddock cleared his throat. "Miss Marple, are you saying you know who murdered Robert Pendleton?" "Oh, quite," she said. "And I should like very much to explain." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "We now know that Robert Pendleton was a blackmailer. He made a profession of preying on the secrets of others, keeping them under his thumb. His little tin box, discovered in the rose garden, contained evidence of his many misdeeds." She glanced at Eleanor. "And among those secrets was the truth about Eleanor Gray, her parentage, which he held over poor Margaret Pendleton's head." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft yet firm. "But Robert made a fatal error. He underestimated the depth of fear and desperation he had instilled in his victims. Someone among you had a secret, too terrible to be exposed, so terrible that they chose murder rather than face it." A hush fell over the room. Craddock's voice was sharp. "Who? Miss Marple?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Let us consider first how Robert was killed. He drank a cup of tea, laced with a fast-acting poison." Dr. Braithwaite nodded. "Aconite, as we determined." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, but the real question is, who served him the tea?" Eyes turned toward Margaret Pendleton, but Miss Marple shook her head. "No," she said gently. "Margaret did not poison her husband, but someone else handled that teacup before it reached him." She turned her gaze toward Jane Hargrove, the gardener. "You were the one who brought in the tea tray, were you not, dear?" Jane stiffened. That doesn't mean anything." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But it does, you see, 'cause that was the only opportunity the murderer had to ensure Robert drank the poisoned cup." Craddock's voice was firm. "Miss Hargrove, suggest you explain yourself." Jane's lips trembled. I didn't do anything," Miss Marple sighed. "Jane, I know why you did it." The room was utterly silent. "You were one of Robert's victims, weren't you?" Miss Marple said softly. Years ago, he must have learned something about you, something dangerous. And when he threatened to expose you, you saw no other way out. Jane's breath came in short, ragged gasps. You don't understand. I do, Miss Marple said. You were afraid. He held something over you, and he would never have let you go. Tears welled in Jane's eyes. I didn't mean to. I just wanted it to stop. Craddock stepped forward, voice gentle, yet authoritative. Jane, what did Robert have on you? Kay let out a sob. I killed my husband, she whispered, years ago. No one ever suspected. But Robert, he found out. He said he'd go to the police unless I paid him, again and again. I had nothing left. Miss Marple sighed. So you saw an opportunity. You poisoned his tea. And you thought, at last, you were free. Jane let out a broken sob and collapsed into a chair. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple before stepping forward. Kay Shane Hargrove, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Robert Pendleton. The gardener buried her face in her hands as the weight of it all came crashing down. Aftermath, the village returned to its quiet rhythm in the days that followed. The scandal of Robert Pendleton's blackmail had left deep scars, but there was also a collective sense of relief. His reign of fear was finally over. Margaret Pendleton, though shaken, found solace in her reunion with Eleanor. Though their relationship had been built on secrets, there was now the possibility of healing. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her cottage, settling into her usual routine of tea and knitting. Chief Inspector Craddock visited her one afternoon, tipping his hat as he took a seat by the fire. You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple, he said. You saw what none of us did. Miss Marple smiled. It is simply a matter of human nature, my dear Inspector. People behave in patterns. Robert Pendleton believed he could control others forever. But in the end, fear is a powerful motivator. Craddock shook his head, and all because of a secret buried in a rose garden. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Secrets have a way of coming to light, Inspector, no matter how deeply they are buried. Outside, the wind rustled through the rose bushes, her petals drifting gently to the ground, a quiet reminder of the past and of the truths that could never stay hidden forever.